Thank you to Wes for agreeing to be our first speaker. He'll be talking about corporate social responsibility and opportunities for CLD research and teaching. Thank you to Sarah for the beautiful poster and for recording this today. And Cara helped organize the food. Wes is allowing us to have a few snacks for our CLD Unexpected, and when possible to tie him in, so I hope Wes will explain his choices. So, and I want to thank the committee, program committee, Dan, Karen, Lissa, and Allie for their help in putting all of this together. And we have a schedule. There will not be a CLD Unexpected in October because Bhattacharya will be visiting and Ron will be coordinating that. In November, on the 10th, the same day as department meeting again, Rebecca and Jay Jackman are going to talk about the Farmer to Farmer program in Uganda and their work this summer. And then on Friday, December 8th, Keiko is going to be talking about cultivating the future of farmers as community development in the case of Japan and her work there. So with that, I'll hand it over to Wes and you can get us started. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to just kind of stay seated and stay kind of in the theme of this is an informal brown bag. But thanks, Julie, and to the program committee for inviting me. I'm flattered that you're interested in hearing what I have to say about corporate social responsibility and kind of how I became interested in this and how I kind of linked my research over the years into this concept. Okay, so Sarah put this together. She did a really good job. So how many of you think social responsibility and corporate go together?
I know what they do.
Nice imagery of what looks like a corporate headquarters, maybe on Wall Street or some sort of a large city. I'm going to play a little YouTube video here, and you'll have to bear with me because I'll have to click through a couple of things to get it started. That was really the prelude, the music that was played in a prelude to a convention that I attended in Las Vegas, held by the National Grocers Association, but it was on corporate social responsibility, and they had the CEOs from PepsiCo, Nestle, Unilever as part of a panel group talking about corporate social responsibility. So it's going to be a bit of a segue from this to my presentation. So bear with me. How many people know who Neil Young is? This is one of his songs written in the late 60s, early 70s called Apple.
Thank
Again, this is a 2016 concert.
those flowers are cool. Seeds.
Seeds.
There were women singing, flowers strong, the orchards with the trees. There was a fanfare blowing through the sun that floated on the breeze. But with Mother Nature on the run in the 21st century. In the 21st century. I was lying in a burned out basement with the full moon in my eyes. I was hoping for replacement when the sun burst through the sky. There was a band playing in my head, and I felt like getting high. Thinking about what a friend had said, I was hoping it was a lie. Well, I dreamed I saw the silver spaceships fly in the yellow haze of the sun. There were children crying, colors flying all around the chosen ones. All in a dream, all in a dream, the loading had begun. We were flying Mother Nature's silver sea to a new home in the sun. Flying Mother Nature's silver sea to a new home.
Okay, so thank you for your indulgence there.
Perfect song.
That was, like I said, it wasn't this version, but it was sort of an intro, a prelude into a convention that I attended that really had corporate CEOs talking about the importance of corporate social responsibility and how it's sort of been integrated into their various companies. So what I wanted to do today is share some of my thoughts. First, just kind of go through them and talk about what corporate social responsibility is, or it's often referred to as CSR. Share with you a little bit about my thinking in terms of some of the implications for CSR with respect to community and development work. Empirical questions, talk a little bit about some of the research questions that I think are interesting research questions that sort of revolve around this notion of corporate social responsibility. And then I'm going to share a little bit of kind of how I've linked this into my research program over the years, and then without sharing a bunch of results with you, empirical results. And then a little bit about what I think there are why I think there are career opportunities for community leadership development graduates as well as other graduates within the College of Agriculture, within certainly around this. All right, so let me start out with the idea of corporate social responsibility has evolved over I don't know, probably a few decades since really the 70s and the 80s. Neil Young was a big counterculture musician who's really very, very popular, but it's sort of emerged over the last few decades. And it takes on a lot of different forms in terms of how corporations and businesses integrate it into their business strategies. But as far as just sort of a national benchmarking standard, that's been developed by this organization called the International Organization for Standards, which are responsible for a variety of ISOs, which you can't read this here, but they're ISOs. It's called ISO codes, basically. But there's a quality management code, environmental management code, kind of a information security management code, cyber security information code. This is an organization that's based out of Geneva, and it's an international organization. And the code, the standards are developed by working teams that are really put together from all aspects of industry and government agencies and so forth in terms of the teams that put the standards together. So there's one called ISO 26000, and it's called their social responsibility ISO. I guess it's also important to note here that this is not an organization that certifies corporate social responsibility or fair trade coffee or anything like that. This is just an international body that sets the standards. Is anybody, you familiar with this, Karen?
I am, but I'm curious when groups do say we fit like ISO 9000 or 26000. What is the certifying agency then? Because I thought they did.
Yeah, I'll talk about that later. Yeah. All right. So, so I'm going to just kind of work off of the definition that they use within this social responsibility standard that they've developed. So, what is corporate social responsibility? It refers to the responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and the environment. And in principle, and again, this is sort of the benchmark principle for how CSR would be implemented. It's implemented through transparent and ethical behavior within an organization that contributes to sustainable development, including the health and welfare of society. Okay, so this is pretty much right out of the international standard developed by the ISO organization. Okay. Notice that is very closely linked to this notion of sustainable development, what sustainable development is, and health and welfare of society. So it's very broad in terms of its definition and I guess thinking in terms of what is sustainable. We typically think of sustainable, I think, as really just focusing on the environment. But in the context of sustainable development as defined by the UN, it's much, much broader than that. So CSR, through this international standard, is pretty much directly linked to the 17 Goals of Sustainable Development developed by the UN. And if you kind of just look across there, you see everything from, this is not necessarily in order of priority. I think it's just the number they chose. But no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, partnerships for goals. So obviously very broad, cutting across all sorts of important and relevant issues that the world faces. Presentation. This is out of the ISO standard. It's basically just the 7 pillars of social responsibility. And you can just kind of look here and see Community involvement and development is one component. Human rights, labor practices, environmental issues or the environment, fair operating practices, consumer issues, all linked into and integrated into the mission of the organization. Now this is the standard for social responsibility. When, as corporations, for-profits, this can be developed by or adopted by for-profits or nonprofits or any organization really.
This is
Typically-
ISO's infographic.
Yes, yeah, that's out of the brochure. Yeah. How this ISO usually plays out in terms of corporations is it also takes into account the expectations of the various stakeholders that are associated with the organization, and this could be obviously stockholders, investors. If we're talking about for-profits, it could be members of nonprofits. It could be just general, any member of the community. It's also developed, particularly obviously in context of applicable laws and regulations that apply to the type of industry or the type of organization. This part right here is really what brings in this notion of the triple bottom line, it's sometimes called. So instead of the focus just being on profits and financial performance, it also includes the scorecard for the organization on the environment and socially in terms of social justice and labor practices and those kind of things. Those are often referred to as the triple bottom line as opposed to the bottom line of financial performance. So that takes into account financial and economic sustainability. The word sustainability again here, it's referring to the sort of the long-term financial performance of the strategy that the corporation follows over essentially perpetuity, really, in terms of corporations. So the focus is more on long-term financial and economic performance and not on short-term financial performance. It's more of a long-term vision with the idea that what's good for the organization should also be good for the sustainability of the community or society in general. Obviously conforms with international norms of behavior and is integrated throughout and practiced in an organization's relationships with other organizations and stakeholders. Now, again, what I'm presenting here is the ISO standard, which is very much sort of a high mark benchmark that's been established by this organization. It manifests itself, CSR manifests itself in all sorts of different ways within organizations at various levels. Okay. So again, this is just sort of the standard. Okay, so why CSR? What's the motivation that we've seen? Why this has become popular within corporations and organizations? Certainly, if you're talking about for-profits, long-run profits and financial performance are an important motivation. The demand for socially responsible products, and I use that term fairly loosely. Starbucks coffee might be considered a socially responsible product. CSR philosophy attracts investors that are interested in long-run growth, that are also interested in business ethics and social responsibility and those types of things. There's some, I guess one hypothesis would also be that we're seeing perhaps a cultural shift in leadership with respect to ethics and social good within corporations. I don't know how many corporate leaders grew up listening to Neil Young and living through the 60s and 70s and so forth, but there's some potential that just cultural shift in leadership is leading to some of this. The last two there at the bottom, for the skeptics in the room, might think these are the principal drivers. Avoiding regulation. This is the idea that if an industry doesn't self-regulate, government will regulate. Okay, so developing standards that imposes some self-constraint, self-regulations as a way to avoid having some sort of a mandated regulation through government action. And then also is a way to mitigate corporate liability that might be associated with what economists call externalities associated with operating in a capitalist market type of setting. These would be environmental damage, pollution, any sort of negative aspect of a business that impacts individuals sort of outside the market that they operate in would be considered a negative externality. This also kind of relates to this concept. How many of you have heard of this concept, greenwashing?
Mm-hmm.
Greenwashing is a term that was, I think, emerged from being used by Greenpeace, the watchdog group Greenpeace. And it refers basically to a corporation that's really just marketing socially responsible strategies. And there's not really any meat and potatoes associated with the actual CSR strategy, which kind of lends itself to this regulation, avoidance, and mitigating corporate responsibility type. Before I share this next slide, I want to say that the corporation that you'll see here in this next slide did have a fairly well recognized corporate social responsibility policy before this event, and they have a pretty strong one now. It's continue to have a strong one now, perhaps stronger than before the event. But the regulation, avoidance, and the mitigating corporate liability will be apparent in this next example, and then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about some of these other motivating factors with respect to corporate social responsibility. Well, there's a delay here. There we go. All right, so how many of you remember this? Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This is played out between April 20th, 2010, July 15, 2010. Largest oil spill, certainly associated with the continental United States, perhaps globally. There were basically three corporations involved. BP owned the rights and leased the tract of land tract of ocean floor that the well was was drilled into. Halliburton was another corporation that BP contracted with to basically seal the wellhead, not really seal it, but basically develop the wellhead so that the drilling, the pipe could be connected to the wellhead. And Transocean, which is the owner of the Deepwater Horizon, which is the name of the rig, the actual oil platform, which was being leased by BP, but the organization or the company that owned it was called Transocean. Yeah. So again, this is just an example of obviously an event where you can kind of see how corporations who develop socially responsible practices, and those are promoted on their web pages. And if you lived in this part of the country, I don't know how many of you saw some of the BP commercials running after the event here, but certainly along the Gulf Coast there were all sorts of commercials that were promoting cleanup and social responsibility and so forth with respect to that. But it was obviously a pretty massive event. These are, this is a little bit dated, what is it, 2010 out of the OMB report. GOM is just Gulf of Mexico. but there are about 4,000 platforms off the coast of Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi that are owned by, or leases that are owned by Exxon, BP, Shell, all the big oil companies. So the potential liability associated with operating this type of business is obviously massive and huge. So again, just an example of why CSR might be used as a way to mitigate corporate liability. These are the pipelines run in that region. They're connecting all that together, so there's pipeline infrastructure as well. So again, this just this is just one of the motivating factors for organizations to be more corporate, be more socially responsible, because they can have fairly massive impacts when there is an accident like this. I think the final settlement on there was a lot of litigation that occurred, as you would imagine, in a federal court in New Orleans, and I think it wrapped up around 2014, and a little over $42 billion. Those three companies had to pay in terms of fines and cleanup funds and really community development or redevelopment funds that they had to develop through the Restore Act, which of course the Restore Act was basically a federal law that was put into place after this event. That placed regulations, further regulations on the industry. The issue of corporate social responsibility is really pretty, it cuts across all different types of industry, but Karen, the extraction industry is obviously an important industry, or a relevant industry for this. I don't know how the coal industry, what kind of corporate social responsibility some of the coal industry.
Do they have?
Sponsor Little League. They do Little League and
Community, very community focused stuff.
Very community.
and they tend to do curricula for elementary schools. Focus on the contribution of coal.
Oh, to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
But
But it-
globally, mining is a big player in CSR. Probably you deal with it a lot in Ecuador, but yeah.
But when we were working in the Tri-Cities of Lynch, Benham, and that were established by U.S. Steel and then sold to somebody else. And they're trying to raise money, those companies have gone, the coal mining's gone, and they're trying to raise money for simple things like putting in a decent water system or sewer system. And they go to those companies and the companies say, that's not our problem.
Right, and there was actually a presentation at the Community Development Society meetings in Montana. I don't know, I think it was an extension faculty from North Dakota or South Dakota was talking about how the, I don't know if it was fracking or whatever, the fracking industry was, developing, they're building things in the community, and it's basically a store and things like this, which kind of like, the old coal mining community stores where it's sort of a monopoly driven. But, so anyway, there's certainly an evil or nefarious side to corporate social responsibility as well as a good side, all right? So the question is, how does that balance out? All right, so here's one I think is an example of a good one, and that is Starbucks example, which relates to the Starbucks coffee that we've got here. These cookies are supposed to be ethically sourced too, but I don't know if that's just
By Aramark?
Anyway, just talk a little bit about Starbucks as an example. And a Starbucks is really focused here is not on mitigating liability and avoiding regulation. Although there's certainly some potential regulation issues associated with the where they source their coffee, but it's really focused on long-term financial performance and communities and building goodwill among their customer base as well as within the communities in which they they have coffee growers. I think an interesting research question for maybe an anthropologist would be to look at those communities and really see if the community, individuals that live in the community, will think that Starbucks policies are good for the community, or if they see them as being more exploitive. But these are, I think, some of the research questions that revolve around this. But anyway, their CSR program revolves around these three areas: sourcing ethically and sustainable ingredients. And Starbucks has grown from from pretty much a coffee company that provides coffee to all sorts of products, as you probably know. Creating opportunities for youth and for young people to have opportunities, business and career opportunities. Focused also on leading in terms of green retail, that is dealing with businesses, working with businesses in terms of suppliers, in terms of their business relationships that are have a green policy in terms of trying to operate in a sustainable way, and then also in investing in the communities that coffee is in the regions where coffee is produced. These are some of just kind of a bullet list of their types of their programs that they have. Ethical sourcing of ingredients, already talked about that. They have farm support centers, very much like extension centers that are run by Starbucks in the regions, and they provide technical support for coffee growers. Global Farmer Fund, which provides presumably low-interest loans to farmers. They have this program they call the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, which challenges other businesses to operate in a sustainable way. The Coffee and Farmer Equity program is really their version of fair trade. Okay. Starbucks, I think, had a lot of fair trade coffee at one point, but they've internalized a lot of their certification well, not really internalized, and I'll explain that in a minute. But instead of having a fair trade label, Starbucks has now gotten the reputation as being an ethically sourced product in general. 100,000 Opportunities Initiatives has to do with employment opportunities. A supplier diversity program refers to a program that is associated with attracting diversity in terms of the farmers, but also in terms of their employees and so forth and so on. It's hard to see. This is just right out of their social CSR annual report. I'll read a couple of these things off, but these are a number of programs. Sourcing commitment, planting trees, providing 100 million trees to 100 million trees to farmers by 2050. These are just basically their goals. They have a goal of 100% ethically sourced coffee. Over here is their progress. They're claiming 99% of their coffee is ethically sourced. You can just kind of go down the list. They have a farmer loan program. Build and operate 10,000 greener stores globally by 2025. Empower 10,000 partners worldwide to be sustainable champions by 2020. So basically, these are the goals, and these are sort of a report. And I can make these available to you if you want to do them. It's easy to find on their webpage. But so it's a pretty detailed strategy. Whether all this is factual or not, I think is where you really get into these third-party certifications, which is what you were asking about earlier, Karen, which is how are these things certified? And that's done through what are called third-party certifiers or certifications, and these are typically nonprofits. Fair Trade is a third-party certifier of a variety of different types of products, coffee being one of them. and I don't have the whole list of criteria or standards that are used, but it basically is focused on sustainability, the idea of sustainability in terms of social responsibility, environmental responsibility, and then also financial performance as well. It's part of it. These are also third-party certification companies. They're all nonprofits. This organization, SCS, certifies most of Starbucks coffee now, but it also certifies fair trade coffee. So Starbucks is working directly with this third-party certification rather than selling the fair trade label, but they're working through the same company, or the same organization that certifies fair trade. This is another group. I can't recall where they're located. They might be Portland, Oregon, and then another one. These are more environmental certifiers. This is more supply chain certifiers. Okay. So it's really the third-party certification that provides the credibility to the programs. And these organizations have armies of auditors they have auditors that go out and audit the supply chain to verify that they're living up to the standards, at least that they claim. So they're part of the sort of the watchdog.
And they are paid by the entity that they are being asked to certify to do that.
Right. Fair trade would be I don't think these are set up as cooperatives. I think they're just nonprofits. But they would be a member of this and would have to pay fees for that certification. Okay.
But would Starbucks then pay SCS Global to
Yes.
do the audit for
Yes.
them?
Starbucks also has one brand of their coffee, the Italian Roast, that still has the fair trade label, and that's this little label up here that's on the package. If you buy Starbucks in the grocery store, most of them will not have the fair trade label. A number of years ago they would, because they were selling more fair trade, but now they've shifted more to a strategy where they're developing the reputation of being socially responsible, ethically sourcing products, and their third-party certification is directly with this organization rather than through fair trade. This is a excerpt from their tax return. This is Fair Trade USA's tax return. Just a couple of excerpts, really. I just want to make one point. So, these nonprofits have to file a tax return. It's called the Form 990, and it's return of an organization exempt from income tax, because they're exempt from income tax. And it's a lengthy form, as you can imagine, with all the president, vice president are all named, and the activities of the organization is all included in there. But the one I wanted to kind of highlight here is they also have a community development premium that is associated with everything that's sold through fair trade. A certain percentage of that goes back to the fair trade, the nonprofit, and they use those funds to fund community development projects in the areas or the regions where where they source coffee with respect to fair trade. This says $32.7 million in community development premiums were issued as farmers fought food prices and drought and plant disease. This is a 2015 tax return. I could find more recently. So anyway, they've got community development funds and components built into the fair trade label. Okay, so this is just a bullet list of what I think are some kind of interesting research or empirical questions associated with social responsibility, CSR. You guys, anthropologists, geographers, sociologists, could probably come up with a lot of other interesting questions research questions that would be associated with this. So just evaluating and assessing the benefits of CSR in terms of the regions in which they operate, whether it be, what is the impact of a CSR strategy on a local community or a regional community. I think there's, if a Research One university isn't looking objectively at how these types of programs impact communities or impact the general public, then who else is there to do that, right? Those third-party certifiers are just interested in certifying that certain things are done as coffee, in the region where the coffee is grown, and we're talking about things like fair wages, clean water, living conditions, these kind of things. These are, coffee sourced in lesser developed countries all over the world. Same thing with cocoa. There are programs for cocoa that's sourced all over the world. The issue of greenwashing versus general cultural shift, or some sort of a general or a real impact, I think is an interesting research question. Are profits, long run, short run, compatible with CSR? If so, under what conditions? Are these win-win strategies where both the organization benefits in terms of financial performance, and also the communities that they're associated with or the stakeholders also benefit? Linkages between CSR and financial performance. There's a lot of research that's done on this in terms of short-run versus long-run profits. And then the role and efficacy of ISOs and third-party certifications, watchdog organizations. I'll talk about product labels here in just a second, a little bit more, in terms of their efficacy and how they factor into some of these other research questions. And you guys, when you start thinking through this, you can probably think of a lot more.
Has there been much or any research on the question of what is the definition or how the certifying agencies define or measure fair wages or diversity within the supplier chain?
I don't know about research, but they will have their own stated standards.
Okay.
I'm not sure how those are developed. Okay. In my last slide, I'll talk a little bit about job opportunities. I mean, I can see we're working for one of these. That might be something you would do is how to determine those, what are fair wages. Just conceptually, as you, I'm sure all know, a fair wage in Kentucky is probably not going to be the same as a fair wage in Seattle or Nicaragua or Costa Rica or Honduras where coffee is grown.
I also think an interesting question to add there would be, you kind of mentioned it, but the impetus for starting an emphasis on this. I remember in the early 2000s, Starbucks was like the example of evil corporation,
Oh, really?
I'm working on a paper, we're talking about the Seattle World Trade Organization protests, and it's just shattered Starbucks windows everywhere. In like 2001 in Louisville, they put a Starbucks in my neighborhood and it had bulletproof glass. That's how hated they were. And I feel like it was Starbucks and Nike. Nike doesn't seem to have gone this way. So it's interesting to see, did that provide pressure to do some of the things that you suggested that they have done? And what made Nike feel like they didn't have to do that? It's all just very, yeah.
And to what extent
A lot of
this was a long-range plan of Starbucks, but they never articulated it well, so that people weren't aware of how they were, what their intentions were versus the greenwashing.
Right.
How much of this goes back to your comment about leadership, and leaders set organizational climate, and what happened with that context.
I'm curious about the source of the animosity, though. Is it because of exploiting coffee growers, or was it?
I think, there's that whole focus on global inequality and stuff with that protest, so I think that was a big part of it. I think it also went around with Starbucks coming in and then local coffee shops
Shops
closing
going
down.
out, yeah,
Oh,
So kind of
yeah,
that double.
competition, yeah.
So they may have been the best company in the world, but if you're closing my coffee shop down, you're
Yes, yes.
yeah, so the motivation, how effective these strategies are in terms of really improving lives and so forth, I think is really core to this topic. All right, so I want to talk about one of those motivations I talked about was the demand for socially responsible products. This is where kind of the work that I've done in the last 10 years or so. And it's linked to brands, but even more specifically, food labels and the way food labels have evolved. How many of you, when you go to the grocery store, read food labels diligently and what nutrition or the nutritional part of it?
Nutritional,
Are you looking for any kind of particular certification?
not necessarily, but I do look to see where the product is from.
Okay.
That's probably
Do you look on the package, the side of the package, and see it's distributed by so-and-so in
Mhm.
Corpus Christi, Texas or something?
Does anybody else do that?
May or may not be where the ingredients come from, and it has to be packaged there.
Yeah.
So we have seen, you can argue that we've seen a demand, an increase in demand for socially responsible products. Somewhat of a loaded question, as we'll talk about here in just a second. But the way this demand is being met operationally is through the growth in the number of different types of food labels and different types of certifications. So everything from salmon safe to New Zealand sustainable wine growing. This is the fair trade certification, cage-free chicken, carbon-free. Should be a GMO-free up there somewhere. If it's not, maybe this is reducing carbon to CO2. The organic label, of course, that one's certified through the USDA. But there's just been a growth of these types of labels, and this has kind of been the area where I've had some interest in terms of looking at how the demand for these and how price premiums are determined for these and so forth. So I promised Julie I was going to have a graph as part of the punishment for inviting an economist to come to one of your CLD Unexpecteds. This is a simple graph. I hope it's not too simple. I don't want to offend you guys. Okay, Karen, tell me what's this graph.
That you're linking production and price.
Yeah, well, this is the economist concept of what we call a demand curve, and a demand curve is just a mathematical function graphically. That's how we depict it, but it's really a concept that we estimate statistically. Okay, economists estimate these curves. Okay, and there's a whole lot of information conceptually embedded in this nice straight linear downward sloping demand curve. Okay, so embodied within this mathematical function, this shows the relationship between the quantity of good demanded, okay, by a consumer. So the demand curve basically represents the consumer's willingness to pay for different quantities of a good, different pounds of coffee, if you will. So this graph is just a two-dimensional depiction of the relationship between the price of the coffee, if you want to use coffee, and the quantity. Okay. There are also a number of other factors that affect demand for any good, if you want to use coffee as an example, and that's the price of other coffees, Folgers, Maxwell House compared to Starbucks. Related goods would be tea as well if you're talking about coffee. Anything that could be used as a substitute beverage It would be kind of related to coffee. Okay. Consumers' income, government rules and regulations that might impact the consumption of coffee. If you want to think about sugar, we've seen some discussions in political circles about taxing sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and those kind of things. That would be a government regulation that would affect the demand. And so these are the ones that most economists tend to focus on: public policy, consumer incomes, prices, right? But there's also consumer preferences, information available about the good, whether or not a consumer is really looking for a product that's associated with a business that follows a corporate social responsibility strategy, so CSR attributes, the quality, food safety risks associated with the product. And then I always tell my students, then there's this ... which means anything else you can think of that might affect the demand for coffee, if coffee is the product we're talking about, that's not covered by one of these other bullet points. Okay.
So maybe you could think about a campaign, a Facebook campaign,
Right.
or a Twitter campaign.
That's kind of in the information area, but yeah, any of that. Seasonality. Okay. Talk about
Weather.
consumption of turkey in around the holidays. That's going to be affect the demand sometimes of the year and other times of the year. So anything you can think of that affects demand could theoretically be modeled in the concept of a demand curve. And even though this is just the old textbook example that maybe you saw if you ever took a introductory econ class and probably got sick of seeing it then, maybe you're sick of seeing it now. But this is just these are real relationships that have been empirically tested over many years and in many settings that that economists focus on.
Is that the real price or the retail price? The real price for me would be the actual cost of the product, and from from growing to shipping to manufacturing, etc.
Well,
The retail price would be the addition of the expectation of profit from the product.
Well, you can. It depends on at what level you want to focus your analysis on. You can, for now, you can just think of it as the retail price.
Okay.
Another type of real price is just inflation-adjusted prices. Okay, you look at through over time. But let's not get into too much minutia because I've got another couple slides and I don't want to. But Karen, go ahead. Ask me a question.
No, I was just, my question about using a sort of straightforward demand curve for talking about things like certification, something that comes out of geography literature and some political economy, is that in fact the price of the good is assuming these are sort of market-based relationships, and that what you have when you have certification is in fact rents that are determined through extra market means, and that what happens in sort of a Starbucks kind of bringing in
Right.
certification is that
Right.
you're pulling that profit not through these market relationships between supply and demand, but through capturing
Right.
the premiums.
Next slide. You're always one step ahead. All right. But so for the terms of how the dynamics work here graphically, though, let me just say one other thing. So the only relationship we can see by looking along this curve is really just the top one. The difference between as the price varies, what does the quantity vary? Everything else shows up as a shift in one direction or another, and we estimate the magnitude of that shift and all those kind of things. Okay. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is all of these factors are indirectly connected to one another. All right. Okay. Let me say that again. So the price of tea indirectly impacts the price of coffee. Okay, because they're substitutes in consumption. Okay, the price of tea goes up, and you're kind of you like both, then you might shift, some consumers will shift away from tea because the price has gone up and into more coffee, and vice versa, back and forth. Think of chicken sandwiches and hamburgers and that kind of stuff too. So consumer incomes affect how sensitive consumers are to price. Obviously, if you've got a higher income, you're not going to be as sensitive to price changes as you are if you're living below the poverty line, right? So these are all related to one another indirectly, and they would be mathematically modeled in a system of demand of relationships, and that's what economists would do. We're not going to do that, but I just want to make sure that you kind of see that these are not just standalones. They do, changes in relative goods will change the shape of the demand curve and so forth. Okay, so enough of that.
Can you use that also for services?